They mocked him for chasing an impossible dream. All they saw was a man in worn-out clothes, sleeping in shelters, carrying a baby in his arms. To the world, Chris Gardner was a failure, a man doomed to vanish into poverty. But what no one knew was that every night on a cold floor, every rejection, every humiliation was shaping a fire that nothing could extinguish. Years later, the same man who once stood in line for free soup would be signing million-dollar contracts on Wall Street. This isn't just a story about money. It's about hope, discipline, and the unshakable belief that even when the world says no, you can still rise and conquer everything. And Chris's journey proves exactly that. Chris Gardner grew up surrounded by poverty, instability, and a broken family. His childhood was marked by the absence of a father and by his mother's constant struggle to keep the family together. He witnessed violence, hunger, and pains that leave scars deeper than skin. Still young, he made a silent promise to himself. He would never let his future children suffer the same hardships. But life had other plans, and the challenges ahead would be even greater. There was no wealth, no inheritance, no safety net. Only the weight of his dreams against the crushing pressure of reality. What he didn't know was that this painful past would become the forge of his discipline. Every tear shed in childhood was transformed into steel within his soul. What once looked like weakness would become the most powerful weapon of his future. As a young man, Chris sought stability by serving in the Navy, but once he left, he bounced between low-paying jobs that barely covered food and rent. His ambitions were far greater than his reality allowed, but every attempt seemed to collapse under the weight of bills and responsibilities. When his marriage ended, Chris was left with custody of his young son, Christopher. That was the turning point. Now, he wasn't just responsible for himself. He carried the life of a child who depended on him to survive. Poverty was no longer an individual struggle. It became a war that would define his destiny. Many around him believed he couldn't handle it, that it was impossible to raise a child alone with no resources. But for Chris, the word impossible was nothing more than a challenge in disguise. He was determined to prove that love and perseverance could overcome any statistic. Walking through the streets of San Francisco, holding his son's small hand, Chris wondered how he would pay for their next meal. The shame of being broke weighed heavily on his chest, but giving up was never an option. Deep inside, he repeated to himself, "This won't be our story forever." He didn't know how, he didn't know when, but he was certain he would rewrite his destiny. The man the world ignored was about to fight back. And without even realizing it, every hard step on those cold sidewalks was silent training for the future. Every closed door was an invitation to knock on another. Every look of contempt was a reminder to keep going. And the moment that would change his life was closer than he imagined. With his marriage over and the weight of raising Christopher alone, Chris sank into an even harsher reality. Late rent piled up, and soon father and son were evicted from the small room they shared. Each day, the fight for survival grew more desperate. Some nights, dinner was nothing more than a piece of bread split unevenly, the bigger portion always for his son. There were nights when Christopher slept unaware that his father stayed awake, crying silently so as not to frighten him. The shame was crushing, but with it came a flame, the certainty that he had to endure. With every fall, he promised himself he would not let his son grow up believing life was nothing but pain and misery. And it was that promise that kept him standing. The most painful moment came when, with nowhere else to go, Chris and his son began sleeping in public shelters and, at times, even in train station bathrooms. The cold floor became their bed, and a backpack served as a makeshift pillow. Still, Chris hid his despair behind a forced smile for his son. He wanted Christopher to believe it was just a phase, a passing adventure. While others slept safely, he stayed awake for hours, planning, praying, and searching for strength. Every roofless night was a cruel reminder of how merciless life could be, but also a test preparing him for something greater. It was as if destiny were asking, "Are you willing to pay the price for the future you want?" For many, that would have been the end. But for Chris, it was only the lowest point before the rise. He understood that when you hit rock bottom, there are only two choices: surrender or use the ground as a springboard to rise. And he chose to rise. With every swallowed tear, every cold night, every rejection, every mocking laugh, his determination grew stronger. Pain didn't weaken him, it forged him. Christopher, even as a small child, was both his anchor and his engine. The boy needed to believe, and the father needed to win. The world could laugh, mock, and point fingers, but he knew giving up was not an option. And it was during this period of darkness that an unexpected opportunity began to appear. Amid the chaos of surviving with a small child, Chris realized he needed more than temporary jobs. He sought a path that could truly change his life. Then, one day, while walking through the streets of San Francisco, he saw a man park a gleaming red Ferrari. The image burned into his mind. Curious and unashamed to ask, Chris approached him and said, "What do you do for a living?" The man replied, "I'm a stockbroker." That simple answer lit a spark inside him that would never go out. For the first time, Chris saw a real possibility of escaping misery. From that moment on, he began obsessively pursuing any information he could about the financial market. He discovered an internship program at a respected brokerage firm, but there was a problem: it was unpaid. For anyone else in his situation, it would have been unthinkable. After all, how could you survive with no salary, a small child, and no home? But to Chris, it wasn't just an internship, it was his doorway out of hell. He knew that if he could get in, he'd have a real chance to change his life. And with nothing but courage, he knocked on the firm's door and asked for an opportunity. At first, he was met with skepticism. Who was this poorly dressed man with no degree, asking for a place in one of the most competitive fields in the world? But there was something about Chris that stood out: his unshakable determination and the passion in the way he spoke about learning. Against all odds, he was accepted into the internship, even knowing he wouldn't earn a cent for it. To many, it seemed like madness. To him, it was the beginning of everything. For the first time, he glimpsed a chance to turn cold nights into a bright future. And little did he know that internship would become both his greatest blessing and his greatest trial. Accepting the unpaid internship was only the first step. Surviving it would be the real war. Every day, Chris woke up before dawn to drop his son off at a public daycare and rush to the brokerage. While his fellow interns arrived in comfortable cars and expensive suits, he showed up in worn clothes with an old briefcase tucked under his arm. The difference was striking, but his dedication outshined appearances. Working tirelessly, he made twice as many calls as the others, studied charts late into the night, and treated every mistake as if it were gold. To Chris, each phone call wasn't just a chance to close a deal, it was a chance to build a future for his son. The routine was brutal. After a full day at the brokerage, Chris rushed to pick up his son and face the long lines at public shelters. Many nights, there was no space, and they were forced to sleep in subway stations or even bathrooms, where Chris improvised a home for the night. While Christopher slept against his chest, Chris stayed awake, reviewing notes and studying the movements of the market. The exhaustion was nearly unbearable, but one thing kept him steady: the vision of better days ahead. He knew he couldn't fail, because every mistake meant more hunger, more cold, more pain. His life had become a race against time, where the final prize was simply dignity. And so, night after night, Chris cultivated an invisible strength, born of discipline and unconditional love. He learned to turn humiliation into fuel, every scornful look into a reminder to keep moving. Slowly, he began to stand out at the firm. His relentless drive caught the attention of some supervisors, who saw in him something rare: the combination of fierce determination and the humility to listen and learn. But the path was still far from over. He was exhausted, overburdened, and with no guarantee of being hired. Then came a final test, one that would decide whether or not he had a place in the competitive world of Wall Street. At the brokerage, the internship was ending, and only a select few would be chosen for full-time positions. The pressure was crushing. Chris knew he couldn't afford to fail. For him, this wasn't just a job, it was survival for his family. While many of his peers had wealthy families to fall back on, Chris had only himself and little Christopher. Every phone call, every meeting, every minute in the office felt like life or death. There was no plan B. He had to be the best, not to prove himself to others, but to prove to his son that he would never give up. The final process was grueling. For days, the candidates were tested in sales, strategy, and emotional endurance. Many quit halfway, crushed by the stress. Chris, however, stood firm, even as his body reached its limit. He would arrive at the shelter in the middle of the night, sleep only a few hours, and still be the first to show up at the firm. His ability to endure pain set him apart. He had been training his whole life to withstand humiliation and failure, and now he turned it all into strength. What others saw as just another challenge, Chris saw as his chance to reclaim dignity. Finally, the moment of decision arrived. The supervisors called the interns into a meeting where the chosen names would be announced. Chris walked in with his heart pounding, knowing his entire life hung on that moment. As names were read aloud, his anxiety nearly consumed him. And then, the impossible happened. His name was called. He had earned the spot. Joy surged inside him, but there was no time for celebration. He knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter. The homeless man now had a place on Wall Street, but the world still had no idea how far Chris Gardner would go. With a steady job secured, Chris could finally breathe, even if only cautiously. For the first time in years, a paycheck was coming in, and it meant more than money. It meant security, dignity, and hope. Yet the path was still demanding. He worked tirelessly to win clients, knowing that every contract signed could change his trajectory. There was no rest. While colleagues celebrated small victories in upscale bars, Chris returned to shelters or cheap rented rooms, keeping his focus on the future. He didn't want just to survive. He wanted to build something solid, something that would show his son that every sacrifice had been worth it. His efforts soon bore fruit. In a short time, Chris closed important deals that drew attention within the firm. His name began circulating in the corridors with respect, and his reputation as disciplined, resilient, and tireless spread quickly. The man who had once been dismissed for his shabby clothes was now standing out in one of the most competitive arenas in the world. And with every victory, he remembered the nights he slept on cold bathroom floors with his son in his arms. Those memories weren't erased by success. They became a constant reminder that pain can be turned into strength. But the true turning point was still ahead. After years of dedication, Chris decided to take a bold step, to open his own brokerage. Many doubted him, laughed, and said he was taking too big a risk. But for Chris, it was the chance to stop being just another name in the market and to become the master of his own destiny. He founded Gardner Rich & Company in a small office, with limited resources but unshakable faith. It was once again the battle of David against Goliath. Only this time, Chris had not just courage, but also experience, discipline, and a clear vision. And what would happen next would turn his name into a symbol of triumph. Starting his own brokerage was a daring leap, but it also brought an enormous weight. Chris woke before sunrise and was the last to leave the office, often falling asleep in a chair surrounded by reports and contracts. The pressure of keeping a business alive in the heart of Wall Street was immense. One wrong decision could cost him everything he had fought so hard to build. There was no margin for error. He carried not only the responsibility of his own future, but also of the team that trusted his leadership. And above all, he bore the promise of giving his son the life he had always dreamed of. The price of success revealed itself in sleepless nights and relentless days. Time for himself was practically non-existent. Chris rarely saw friends, and the few moments of leisure were almost always interrupted by client phone calls. Stress was constant, and there were days when he felt he had no strength left to continue. But whenever he remembered the laughter of the past, the torn shoes, and the little boy sleeping in shelters, his heart reignited with fire. He understood that every sacrifice was another brick laid in the foundation of the life he was building. Unlike many who sought shortcuts, Chris embraced the hard road as part of the journey. Success, he discovered, doesn't come from convenience. It comes from the discipline to endure the pain others avoid. Even exhausted, he began to reap the first signs of victory. His brokerage was growing, clients trusted his work, and his name was becoming established in the market. Still, Chris wasn't blinded by the shine of money. He knew true wealth wasn't about showing off, but about staying true to the purpose that had carried him this far, to prove that anyone can win, no matter where they start. Every obstacle was a reminder that he had chosen a road with no return. And little did he know, the price he paid in sweat and tears would soon lead him to worldwide recognition. In his early 30s, Chris was no longer just another successful broker. He was the owner of a company growing at an impressive pace. Gardner Rich and Company expanded, winning bigger clients and solidifying its position in the market. The man who once slept in public shelters was now closing contracts in luxurious offices, surrounded by respected investors. But for him, success was never only about money. Chris believed his empire had to carry a greater purpose, to be living proof that determination can transform any destiny. That's why every achievement was celebrated with humility and remembrance of his origins. Over time, his story began to attract attention beyond the financial world. Newspapers and magazines highlighted his journey with powerful headlines, from cold floors to the top of Wall Street, from homeless to millionaire, the man who turned pain into victory. For thousands, Chris became an inspiration, proof that there are no limits for those who refuse to give up. For others, his rise was a sobering reminder that underestimating someone may be the greatest mistake. But regardless of opinions, one thing was undeniable. He had become a giant in business and a symbol of resilience. Yet the most symbolic moment of his empire's consolidation didn't happen on Wall Street, but in his old school. Chris was invited back, this time as an example of triumph. He walked the same hallways that once echoed with laughter at his expense, and was greeted with a standing ovation. The teachers who had once doubted him now looked at him with admiration. Students saw him as proof that impossible dreams can be achieved. For Chris, that moment was priceless, and the speech he gave to those young people changed not only how they saw him, but also their own lives. In the packed auditorium of his old school, Chris took a deep breath before stepping onto the stage. The very place that had once been a stage for humiliation now welcomed him with thunderous applause. Hundreds of students, teachers, and even old neighbors had gathered to hear his story. He used no fancy words, nor did he try to appear perfect. With a steady voice, he spoke of nights in shelters, of hidden tears, of the days he didn't know if he could feed his son. He didn't hide his failures, because he knew it was exactly those failures that gave value to his victories. And then he declared, "They laughed at me when I said I would be rich, but I didn't let their laughter decide my destiny." The silence that followed was absolute. Many students cried, moved not only by his story, but because they saw their own struggles reflected in him. Yes, he spoke of wealth, but not just about money. He spoke of the courage to believe in yourself when everyone else doubts you. He showed that discipline and faith are more powerful than any circumstance. Each phrase was like an arrow shot straight into the hearts of those young people, awakening dreams that had long been asleep. Teachers exchanged glances, deeply impacted by the living example that it's never too late to rewrite your story. And then Chris concluded with words that would echo throughout the school. "You may laugh at someone today, but you never know if tomorrow that person will own everything. The auditorium erupted in applause, teachers wept, students rose to their feet, and for a few minutes, the room seemed to shake with the power of hope. He stepped off the stage with a light heart, knowing he had fulfilled his mission to inspire a new generation to believe. But what Chris didn't expect was that this speech, recorded on a simple cell phone, was about to travel the world and turn his story into a universal symbol of triumph. Today, Chris Gardner is the owner of multi-million-dollar companies, a respected investor, and a man whose story is told in lectures, books, and even in film. But for him, nothing surpasses the personal victory of giving his son a life of dignity and hope. Every night spent on a cold floor, every tear swallowed in silence, every door slammed in his face was transformed into steps that carried him to the top. The homeless man the world once mocked is now remembered as a global example of courage. His greatest wealth isn't in accumulated money, but in the legacy of resilience that inspires millions every day. Chris's life proves one undeniable truth. It doesn't matter where you come from, but where you're willing to go. Laughter and criticism do not define anyone's future. What truly builds destiny is discipline, vision, and the ability to endure pain without giving up. While many believed he would be just another broken man, he showed that faith in yourself can shatter any barrier. He didn't run from failure. He embraced each one as a lesson that shaped him. His journey is living proof that even the most unlikely can become reality when you refuse to stop. But perhaps the most powerful of all is what Chris chose to become beyond wealth. He didn't just want to accumulate money. He wanted to show the world that the limits imposed by others are nothing but fragile illusions. Today, those who once laughed can only applaud. His name echoes not only as that of a millionaire, but as that of a victor who dared to believe when everything seemed lost. And the lesson he leaves is clear. Pain may be the beginning. Discipline is the path, and faith in yourself is the key that makes the impossible real. If Chris Gardner's true story inspired you, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share this inspiration with someone. Every day, you'll find here the strength you need to never give up on your dreams.